The sun was setting over Dallas, Texas, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Chuck Norris pulled his black baseball cap lower over his eyes as he walked through the parking lot of a small grocery store on the outskirts of town. After decades in the spotlight, the martial arts legend had learned the art of blending in when he wanted some peace and quiet. At 78 years old, Chuck still maintained his impressive physique. But tonight he just wanted to pick up some groceries, without being recognized. He wore a simple gray hoodie, old jeans, and worn sneakers. His famous beard was neatly trimmed but partially hidden by the cap's shadow. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another regular customer heading home after a long day. The automatic door slid open with a soft whoosh as Chuck entered the store. The familiar smell of fresh produce and cleaning supplies filled his nostrils. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a bright, sterile glow. He grabbed a shopping cart and began making his way through the aisles, moving with the quiet confidence that had made him a legend in Hollywood action films. Chuck had always preferred smaller family-owned stores like this one over the massive chain supermarkets. There was something authentic about places like Murphy's Market, where the owners still knew their customers by name and the employees weren't just numbers on a corporate spreadsheet. The store had been serving the local community for over 30 years, and Chuck respected that kind of dedication. As he moved through the produce section selecting fresh vegetables for his wife Gina's favorite salad, Chuck noticed the store seemed unusually quiet for a Friday evening. Only a few other customers wandered the aisles and some of the shelves appeared less stocked than usual. He picked up some organic tomatoes, testing their firmness with the practiced touch of someone who genuinely enjoyed cooking for his family. The martial arts master had always been observant, a skill honed through years of training and countless movie roles where attention to detail could mean the difference between a good scene and a great one. Something felt different about this place tonight, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Moving to the dairy section, Chuck selected some milk and yogurt, his movements smooth and purposeful despite his age. A young mother with 2 small children passed by, struggling to manage her shopping while keeping her kids entertained. Without hesitation, Chuck reached up to grab a box of cereal from a high shelf that she'd been trying to reach. "Thank you so much," she said with a grateful smile, not recognizing the famous face beneath the cap. "No problem at all," Chuck replied in his characteristic soft-spoken manner, his voice carrying that familiar Texas drawl that had charmed audiences for decades. As he continued shopping, Chuck found himself studying the store's layout and the people around him. It was a habit from his younger days in the military and later in his acting career, where being aware of your surroundings wasn't just useful, it was essential. The store had a warm community feel that reminded him of the small-town values he'd grown up with in Oklahoma. Near the frozen food section, Chuck overheard 2 elderly customers discussing something in hushed, worried tones. He couldn't make out all the words, but he caught fragments about changes and corporate takeover and not the same anymore. Their concern was evident in their voices, and it stirred something protective in Chuck's nature. He'd always had a soft spot for the underdog, whether it was in his movies where he played characters fighting against corruption and injustice, or in real life through his various charitable endeavors. The idea that this small community store might be facing difficulties bothered him more than he expected. Moving toward the front of the store to check out, Chuck noticed there was only one register open despite it being dinner time on a Friday. Behind the counter stood a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and tired eyes that spoke of long hours and heavy responsibilities. She moved efficiently despite her obvious fatigue, scanning items with practiced speed while offering genuine smiles to each customer. Chuck watched as she helped an elderly man count out exact change with patience and kindness, never showing any sign of irritation, even though there was a line forming behind him. There was something about her demeanor that caught Chuck's attention. She carried herself with a dignity that reminded him of his own mother, who had worked multiple jobs to support their family when he was growing up. This young woman had that same quiet strength, that same determination to do right by people even when circumstances were challenging. As Chuck approached the register with his modest selection of groceries, he found himself hoping for a brief, anonymous transaction. After a lifetime in the public eye, these moments of normalcy had become precious to him. He just wanted to pay for his items and head home to Gina, maybe catch up on some reading before bed. But as he got closer to the checkout counter, Chuck began to pick up on a conversation taking place near the customer service desk. A man in an expensive suit was speaking in low, urgent tones to someone who appeared to be a manager. The body language was tense, and Chuck's instincts told him this wasn't a routine business discussion. The young cashier glanced nervously in that direction several times as she continued working, her professional smile becoming more strained with each passing minute. Chuck noticed her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for the scanner, and there was a vulnerability in her eyes that made his protective instincts kick into high gear. Whatever was happening in this small store tonight, Chuck Norris was about to become an unexpected witness to a situation that would test his ability to remain incognito and challenge his natural inclination to help those in need. Chuck placed his items on the conveyor belt and watched as the young cashier began scanning them with mechanical precision. Her name tag read Sarah, and up close he could see the worry lines around her eyes that seemed too deep for someone so young. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for a long time, but her usual cheerful demeanor was clearly strained. "Did you find everything okay tonight?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the practiced politeness of retail work, though Chuck detected a slight tremor beneath the professional facade. "Yes, thank you," Chuck replied quietly, keeping his voice low and his head tilted down. He handed her his reusable shopping bag, noticing how her hands shook almost imperceptibly as she took it from him. As Sarah continued scanning his items, the conversation at the customer service desk grew more heated. Chuck couldn't help but listen as the man in the expensive suit spoke to someone who was clearly the store manager, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and worry etched across her face. "Mrs. Murphy, you know as well as I do that the numbers just don't add up anymore," the suited man was saying, his voice carrying the cold efficiency of corporate restructuring. "Pemberton Industries has been more than patient, but we can't continue operating at a loss indefinitely." Chuck's jaw tightened slightly. He'd encountered plenty of corporate types like this throughout his career in Hollywood. People who saw dollar signs instead of human faces, who could reduce someone's livelihood to numbers on a spreadsheet without losing a moment's sleep. Mrs. Murphy, who Chuck now realized must be the daughter or daughter-in-law of the store's founder, was clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "Mr. Davidson, surely there must be something we can do. This store has been serving the community for 3 decades. These people depend on us and our employees. They're like family." "Business is business, Mrs. Murphy," Davidson replied with the kind of practiced indifference that made Chuck's hands clench into fists. "We've already extended the deadline twice. You have until Monday to show us a viable plan for profitability, or we'll have no choice but to begin the closure process." Sarah's scanning had slowed considerably, and Chuck realized she was trying to listen to the conversation while pretending to focus on her work. When she accidentally scanned the same item twice, she quickly voided it with an embarrassed apology, her cheeks flushing pink. "No worries at all," Chuck said gently, his voice carrying the warmth that had always made him popular with fans and coworkers alike. "Take your time." The sincerity in his tone seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She looked up at him properly for the first time, though the bill of his cap kept most of his face in shadow. Something in his demeanor, the quiet confidence, the genuine kindness seemed to calm her slightly. "Thank you for being patient," she said, and this time her smile was real rather than practiced. "It's been a really difficult day." Chuck nodded understandingly, wanting to say more but knowing that revealing his identity would only complicate matters. Instead, he simply waited as she finished scanning his groceries, watching as she carefully bagged each item with the attention to detail that spoke of someone who took pride in doing even small jobs well. The conversation behind them continued, and Chuck caught more fragments that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Apparently, Murphy's Market had been struggling financially for months, hit hard by competition from larger chains and the economic pressures that had devastated many small businesses. Pemberton Industries had bought the store's debt and was now calling in their markers. "What about the employees?" Mrs. Murphy was asking, her voice thick with emotion. "Some of these people have worked here for over a decade. Sarah Henderson has been with us since she was 16, putting herself through college while helping support her grandmother. You can't just... Mrs. Murphy, Davidson interrupted coldly. I understand your emotional attachment, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. These employees will receive their final paychecks and whatever severance the law requires. That's more than generous under the circumstances. Chuck felt his protective instincts surge. Throughout his career, both in martial arts and entertainment, he'd always stood up for those who couldn't defend themselves. The idea of this young woman losing her job, especially when she was clearly working so hard to support herself and her family, triggered every heroic impulse he'd ever had. Sarah had gone very quiet, her movements becoming more robotic as she processed Chuck's payment. He could see her fighting back tears, and the sight reminded him of his own daughter at that age, trying to be strong in the face of circumstances beyond her control. Your total is $23.47, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. As Chuck reached for his wallet, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of using his credit card, which would have revealed his identity, he pulled out $30 in cash, including a generous tip that he pressed into Sarah's hand along with the payment. Keep the change, he said softly. And whatever's happening over there, don't give up hope. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Sarah looked down at the extra money in surprise, then back up at this mysterious customer who seemed to understand her situation without any explanation. There was something in his eyes visible now beneath the cap's brim that made her feel like maybe things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. Thank you, she whispered, clutching the money like a lifeline. You don't know how much this means. Chuck picked up his grocery bags, but instead of heading for the exit, he found himself lingering near the magazine rack, pretending to browse while keeping one ear tuned to the ongoing conversation at the customer service desk. Every instinct told him to walk away, to maintain his anonymity and avoid getting involved in a situation that wasn't his business. But as he watched Sarah return to her work with visible effort, forcing another professional smile as the next customer approached, Chuck Norris knew he couldn't simply walk away. Not when someone who reminded him so much of his own values, hard work, dignity, treating others with respect, was facing circumstances completely beyond her control. The corporate executive was wrapping up his ultimatum, preparing to leave Mrs. Murphy to face an impossible deadline. In just a few minutes, Chuck would have to make a choice: maintain his incognito status and let events unfold naturally, or step forward and risk everything to help strangers who had no idea they were about to receive assistance from one of the most famous martial artists in the world. Chuck pretended to flip through a cooking magazine while Davidson gathered his briefcase and prepared to leave. The corporate executive's cold demeanor hadn't softened one bit during the entire conversation, and Chuck could see the devastation written across Mrs. Murphy's face as she realized the finality of the situation. I'll expect your response by Monday at 5 p.m., Davidson said, straightening his tie with the casual indifference of someone delivering a death sentence. If we don't receive a viable restructuring plan by then, the closure process will begin. Immediately, all employees will be terminated effective Tuesday morning. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Chuck watched as she gripped the edge of the checkout counter, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to maintain her composure. In front of the customer still in line, a teenage boy was approaching with an energy drink and a bag of chips, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few feet away. Mrs. Murphy walked Davidson toward the exit, her shoulders sagging under the weight of impossible circumstances. Chuck could hear fragments of her desperate last-minute appeals, but the corporate executive remained unmoved. As they passed near the magazine rack where Chuck stood, he got a closer look at Davidson, a man in his 50s with perfectly styled silver hair, expensive suit, and the kind of predatory confidence that came from wielding power over other people's lives. After Davidson left, the store seemed to exhale collectively, but it was the heavy sigh of defeat rather than relief. Mrs. Murphy stood by the exit for a long moment, watching his car pull away into the night, before slowly making her way back toward the customer service desk. Chuck observed everything with the tactical awareness that had served him well throughout his military and entertainment careers. He noticed how the other employees, a stock clerk and a deli worker, had been watching the confrontation with barely concealed anxiety. These weren't just jobs on the line. These were livelihoods, families depending on paychecks, dreams hanging in the balance. Sarah was struggling now. The teenage customer had been replaced by an elderly woman buying cat food and prescription medications, and Sarah's usual efficiency was compromised by the emotional toll of what she'd just witnessed. She miscounted change twice and had to restart the transaction when her hands trembled too badly to operate the register properly. "I'm so sorry," Sarah kept saying, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm having a really difficult evening." The elderly customer was patient and kind, recognizing genuine distress when she saw it. "Take your time, dear," she said gently. "We all have those days." Chuck made his decision in that moment. He couldn't walk away from this, not when he had the resources and influence to potentially make a difference. But he also knew that revealing his identity right now, in this emotional moment, might create more chaos than help. He needed to approach this carefully, strategically. Moving closer to the customer service desk, Chuck positioned himself where he could overhear Mrs. Murphy's phone conversation. She was calling her husband, her voice breaking as she explained Davidson's ultimatum. "I don't know what else to do, Jim," she was saying. "We've cut every expense we can think of. We're already operating with a skeleton crew, and our profit margins are razor thin. That new supermart that opened 6 months ago has taken away half our customer base." Chuck processed this information quickly. The situation was more complex than just corporate greed, though Davidson's callous approach certainly qualified. This was a small business caught in the crossfire of changing retail landscapes, unable to compete with the massive buying power and rock-bottom prices of chain stores. As Mrs. Murphy finished her call, Chuck approached the customer service desk. She looked up with the weary expression of someone who had spent the day delivering bad news and receiving none in return. "Excuse me," Chuck said quietly, keeping his voice low and his cap pulled down. "I couldn't help overhearing some of what happened. Is there anything a community member can do to help?" Mrs. Murphy studied him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. In her experience, most people offered help in vague, non-committal ways that never materialized into actual assistance. But something about this customer, his genuine concern, the way he stood with quiet confidence, made her want to trust him. "That's very kind of you to ask," she said, her voice still shaky from the emotional toll of the evening. "But honestly, I don't know if there's anything anyone can do at this point. We need to find a way to increase our revenue by 30% almost overnight, and that's just not realistic for a store our size." Chuck nodded thoughtfully. "What if someone were willing to invest in the business, or help with marketing to bring in new customers?" The question caught Mrs. Murphy off guard. She'd been so focused on cost-cutting measures that she hadn't really considered the possibility of outside investment or innovative marketing strategies. I suppose that could help," she admitted. "But we'd need someone with real resources, not just good intentions. And frankly, I'm not sure why anyone would want to invest in a struggling grocery store when they could put their money into something with better returns." "Sometimes," Chuck said carefully, "people invest in things because they believe in what they represent, not just what they can profit from. A store like this, it's the heart of a community. That has value beyond what shows up on financial statements." Mrs. Murphy looked at him with new interest. There was something about the way he spoke, the confidence in his voice, that suggested he might know something about business and investment beyond casual customer commentary. Meanwhile, Sarah had finished with the elderly customer and was now standing alone at her register, no longer able to hold back the tears that had been threatening all evening. She thought she was out of sight behind the checkout counter, but Chuck could see her quietly sobbing into her hands, overwhelmed by the prospect of losing her job and letting down her grandmother, who depended on her income. The sight of her distress crystallized Chuck's resolve. This wasn't just about business metrics or corporate restructuring. This was about real people facing real consequences through no fault of their own. Sarah had been working since she was 16, putting herself through college while supporting her family. She embodied everything Chuck believed in about hard work, responsibility, and taking care of the people you love. Mrs. Murphy, Chuck said, his voice taking on a more decisive tone. What if I told you that help might be closer than you think? What if someone wanted to discuss this situation more seriously? Tomorrow, perhaps, when you've had time to think through your options. Something in his demeanor made Mrs. Murphy pause. This wasn't the casual concern of a sympathetic customer. This felt like someone who might actually have the resources and determination to make a difference. Are you serious? She asked, hardly daring to hope. More serious than you might imagine, Chuck replied, glancing over at Sarah, who was still trying to compose herself before the next customer arrived. Sometimes the most unexpected help comes from the most unexpected places. The next morning, Chuck Norris sat in his home office, surrounded by the comfortable memorabilia of a legendary career. Photos from movie sets, martial arts trophies, and family pictures filled the shelves, but his attention was focused on the laptop screen in front of him and the phone calls he'd been making since dawn. After a restless night thinking about the situation at Murphy's Market, Chuck had decided to take action. But he approached it the same way he'd approached every major decision in his life, with careful planning, thorough research, and strategic thinking that came from decades of experience in high-stakes situations. His first call had been to his business manager, Robert Chen, who had handled Chuck's investments and charitable foundation for over 15 years. Robert was used to Chuck's occasional impulses to help people in need, but this request was more substantial than usual. Chuck, you want to do what? Robert had asked, clearly needing clarification. I want to invest in a small grocery store that's facing closure, Chuck had explained. But I want to do it anonymously, at least initially. The people there are hard-working folks caught in circumstances beyond their control, and I think we can help them succeed if we approach this right. Now, several hours later, Chuck had assembled a comprehensive understanding of the situation. Robert had worked his network of contacts to get financial information about Pemberton Industries, Murphy's Market, and the local retail landscape. What they discovered was both troubling and promising. Pemberton Industries was exactly what Chuck had suspected, a corporate entity that specialized in acquiring distressed assets, extracting whatever value they could, and disposing of the rest. They had no interest in preserving community institutions or protecting employees. Their business model was purely predatory, buying up struggling businesses at below-market prices and then either flipping them quickly or liquidating the assets. Murphy's Market, on the other hand, represented everything Chuck admired about small business ownership. The Murphy family had built their store gradually over 3 decades, prioritizing customer service and community involvement over maximum profit. They had loyal customers, dedicated employees, and a reputation for integrity that money couldn't buy. The problem was competition. The new supermart had indeed devastated their customer base, not through superior service or quality, but simply through the ability to sell basic groceries at prices Murphy's couldn't match due to massive volume purchasing power. It was a story, playing out in small communities across America, and Chuck understood that this battle was about more than just one grocery store. His research had also revealed some interesting information about Sarah Henderson. Through careful inquiries that didn't violate her privacy, Chuck had learned that she was indeed 22 years old, had been working at Murphy's Market for 6 years while finishing her degree in social work, and was the primary caregiver for her grandmother, who suffered from early-stage dementia. Her grandmother's medical expenses weren't fully covered by insurance, making Sarah's steady income essential for both their survival. But Sarah wasn't the only employee facing hardship. The stock clerk was a 19-year-old named Marcus who was saving money for trade school while helping support his younger siblings after their father had been injured in a construction accident. The deli worker, Elena, was a single mother of 2 who had been with the store for 8 years and had finally achieved some financial stability. These weren't just abstract employees facing unemployment. These were people with families, dreams, and responsibilities that extended far beyond themselves. Chuck found their dedication and resilience inspiring, and it reinforced his determination to help. By late morning, Chuck had developed a plan. It was ambitious and would require careful coordination, but it addressed both the immediate crisis and the long-term sustainability challenges facing Murphy's Market. The first phase involved immediate financial intervention. Chuck was prepared to personally assume the debt that Pemberton Industries held over the store, effectively buying them out and removing their predatory influence. This would require a significant cash investment, but Chuck had been fortunate in his business dealings and had the resources available. The second phase was more complex and involved repositioning Murphy's Market to compete more effectively with the chain stores. Instead of trying to beat Supermart at their own game, Chuck's plan would focus on what made small stores special: personalized service, community connection, and specializing in products and services that the big chains couldn't or wouldn't provide. Robert had connected Chuck with a retail consultant who specialized in helping small businesses adapt to changing markets. The consultant, Maria Rodriguez, had experience with similar situations and was excited about the possibilities for Murphy's Market. The key is differentiation, Maria had explained during their phone conversation. You can't compete on price alone, but you can compete on experience, convenience, and community value. There are proven strategies for helping stores like this not just survive, but thrive. The third phase of Chuck's plan involved long-term sustainability and growth. He wanted to help Murphy's Market become a model for how small community stores could adapt and succeed in the modern retail environment. This would involve employee training, technology upgrades, marketing initiatives, and possibly even expansion into related services. But Chuck also understood that his involvement needed to be handled delicately. If word got out that Chuck Norris was backing a small grocery store, it could create media attention that might actually harm the business rather than help it. The store needed to succeed on its own merits, not because of celebrity association. Chuck looked at his watch and realized it was time for the next phase of his plan. He had arranged to meet with Mrs. Murphy at her store that afternoon, still maintaining his anonymous identity, but prepared to make a serious proposal. Sarah would be working her shift, still unaware that her simple interaction with a customer the night before had set in motion a series of events that could change her life completely. Before leaving his office, Chuck made one more call to his attorney to ensure all the legal paperwork was prepared. If Mrs. Murphy agreed to his proposal, they could move quickly to resolve the immediate crisis with Pemberton Industries. As he drove toward Murphy's Market, Chuck reflected on the strange turns life could take. 24 hours ago, he had just wanted to buy some groceries anonymously. Now he was about to embark on a business venture that could impact an entire community. But that was the thing about doing the right thing. It didn't always happen at convenient times or in expected ways. The afternoon sun was bright as Chuck pulled into the familiar parking lot, once again dressed casually with his baseball cap pulled low. This time, however, he carried with him the power to change everything for the people inside that store. The question was whether they would trust a mysterious stranger enough to accept his help. Chuck entered Murphy's Market at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents that could save the store. The atmosphere was noticeably different from the night before. There was an underlying tension that seemed to affect everyone, from the customers who moved through the aisles with hurried efficiency, to the employees who worked with the grim determination of people facing an uncertain future. Sarah was at her register again, and Chuck could see that she had clearly been crying earlier in the day. Her eyes were red-rimmed despite her attempt to cover it with makeup, and her usual bright demeanor was replaced by a professional mask that couldn't quite hide her despair. She was helping an older gentleman with his groceries, maintaining her courteous service despite everything she was going through personally. Mrs. Murphy was behind the customer service desk, surrounded by paperwork and looking like she hadn't slept much the night before. She kept checking the clock on the wall, clearly counting down the hours until Monday's 5 p.m. deadline. When she noticed Chuck approaching, her expression shifted to one of cautious hope mixed with skepticism. "You came back," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and desperate optimism. "I told you I was serious," Chuck replied quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation would remain private. "Is there somewhere we can talk without being overheard?" Mrs. Murphy led him to a small office behind the customer service area, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets, inventory reports, and family photos spanning 3 decades of Murphy family involvement in the store. Chuck noticed a picture of what must have been the original Mr. Murphy standing proudly in front of the store on opening day, surrounded by his wife and young children. "Before we begin," Mrs. Murphy said, settling into her desk chair while Chuck took the single visitor chair, "I have to ask, who exactly are you? Last night you seemed like just another customer, but something about this feels much bigger than casual community concern." Chuck had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time thinking about how to handle it. Complete anonymity was no longer practical if he was going to make a serious business proposal, but he also wanted to keep the focus on the store and its employees rather than on his celebrity status. "My name is Chuck," he said simply, pulling off his baseball cap for the first time and allowing Mrs. Murphy to see his face clearly. "And I think you might recognize me." Mrs. Murphy's eyes widened as recognition dawned. She stared at him for several seconds, clearly processing the surreal nature of having Chuck Norris sitting in her small office discussing business investments. "Oh my God," she whispered, then immediately looked embarrassed by her reaction. "I mean, I'm sorry, but you're actually Chuck Norris." "I am," Chuck confirmed with a gentle smile. "But right now, I'm just someone who wants to help save your store and protect your employees' jobs. What I'm about to propose is serious business, not a publicity stunt or charity case. I believe Murphy's Market can not only survive, but thrive, with the right support and strategic changes." Mrs. Murphy was still processing the reality of the situation, but Chuck's businesslike tone helped her focus on the practical aspects rather than the celebrity factor. "I've done my research," Chuck continued, opening his portfolio and spreading several documents on her desk. "I know about the debt to Pemberton Industries, your cash flow challenges, and the competitive pressure from Supermart. I also know about the quality of your employees and your reputation in the community. Those are assets that can't be bought or replicated." He showed her a financial analysis prepared by his business team that outlined both the store's current situation and its potential for improvement with proper investment and strategic repositioning. "I'm prepared to buy out Pemberton's debt immediately," Chuck said, watching her reaction carefully. "That removes their ability to force closure and gives us time to implement changes that will make the store profitable long term." Mrs. Murphy studied the documents, her hands trembling slightly as she grasped the magnitude of what was being offered. This is several $100,000 you're talking about. Why would you do this for strangers?" Chuck leaned back in his chair, considering how to explain motivations that were deeply personal yet universally understandable. "Because your store represents something I believe in," he said finally. "When I was growing up, my family didn't have much money. My mother worked multiple jobs to keep us fed and housed, and she taught me that success meant using whatever gifts you have to help others when you can. I've been fortunate in my career, and that comes with responsibilities." He gestured toward the door where they could hear Sarah's voice as she helped customers, still maintaining her professional courtesy despite her personal crisis. "But more specifically, because of your employees. Last night I watched Sarah provide excellent service while dealing with the knowledge that she might lose her job. That kind of character and dedication doesn't happen by accident. You've created something here that's worth preserving." Mrs. Murphy wiped away tears that had started flowing during Chuck's explanation. "The employees, they're like family. Sarah has been with us since she was 16. She's put herself through college working here while taking care of her grandmother. Marcus is saving for trade school while helping support his siblings. Elena finally achieved some stability for her children. The thought of having to let them go—" "You won't have to," Chuck said firmly. "But this isn't just about preserving jobs. It's about helping your store become successful enough that these employees can have career growth and security. My business consultant has developed a plan that we think can increase your revenue significantly within the first year." He showed her Maria Rodriguez's strategic plan, which included ideas for specialty departments, community events, online ordering with local delivery, and partnerships with local farms and artisans that would differentiate Murphy's Market from the chain stores. "The key is playing to your strengths," Chuck explained. Supermart can beat you on price for packaged goods, but they can't beat you on personal service, community connection, or specialized products. We're going to help you become the store people choose to shop at, not just the store they have to shop at. Mrs. Murphy was studying the plans with growing excitement. Her business, instincts recognizing the potential in what was being proposed. But why maintain the anonymity? She asked. Surely if people knew Chuck Norris was backing the store, that would bring in customers. Chuck shook his head. That kind of attention would turn this into a curiosity rather than a legitimate business. People would come to see the store Chuck Norris owns, not to shop at Murphy's Market. Your success needs to be based on what you offer as a store, not on my involvement. Outside the office, they could hear the familiar sounds of the store operating. The beep of scanners, the rustle of shopping bags, the friendly conversations between staff and customers. It was the sound of a community institution that had served generations of families, and Chuck was determined to ensure it continued for generations to come. So, what do you say? Chuck asked, extending his hand across the desk. Are you ready to save Murphy's Market and show everyone what a community store can accomplish when it has the right support? 6 months later, Sarah Henderson stood behind the register at Murphy's Market, but everything around her had transformed beyond recognition. The same genuine smile that had caught Chuck's attention was still there, but now it was accompanied by confidence that came from knowing she had a secure future and was part of something special. The store bustled with activity on this Saturday morning, but it was a different kind of busy than the desperate scramble of a failing business. Customers moved through aisles that had been redesigned for better flow and accessibility, past displays featuring locally sourced produce, artisanal products from regional craftspeople, and specialty items that couldn't be found at Supermart. Sarah had been promoted to customer service manager 3 months earlier, a position that came with both increased responsibility and a significant raise that had allowed her to move her grandmother into a better assisted living facility. She now oversaw 2 other cashiers and helped train new employees in the Murphy's Market way of doing business, treating every customer like a valued neighbor and every transaction like an opportunity to strengthen community bonds. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks after Chuck's intervention had been intense, with consultants, contractors, and new systems being implemented while the store continued operating. Sarah had watched in amazement as the mysterious customer who had shown her such kindness revealed himself to be not just Chuck Norris, but someone genuinely committed to making their store successful. Chuck had kept his promise about maintaining a low profile. His involvement was structured through a business partnership that kept his name out of the public records, and he rarely visited the store during operating hours. When he did come by, usually in the early morning or late evening, he still wore his baseball cap and casual clothes, preferring to observe the results of his investment rather than draw attention to himself. The changes had been dramatic but thoughtful. The old fluorescent lighting had been replaced with warmer LED fixtures that made the store feel more welcoming. The produce section now featured a partnership with 3 local farms that provided fresh, organic vegetables and fruits that customers couldn't get at the chain stores. A new deli section offered prepared foods made with recipes from longtime community members, turning the store into a destination for lunch rather than just basic groceries. Marcus, the young stock clerk, had been promoted to inventory manager and was enrolled in a business program at the community college, with Murphy's Market paying his tuition as part of Chuck's commitment to employee development. Elena had become the head of the new catering department, which had quickly become popular for local events and business meetings. But perhaps the most significant change was in the store's relationship with the community. Maria Rodriguez's strategic plan had included monthly events that turned Murphy's Market into a gathering place. Cooking demonstrations, local author readings, farmers market-style events in the parking lot, and even self-defense classes that Chuck occasionally taught. Under an assumed name, the financial turnaround had been remarkable. Within 4 months, the store was operating profitably for the first time in over a year. Customer loyalty had increased dramatically, not just because of the improved offerings, but because word had spread about how the store had fought to stay open and keep its employees. People chose to shop at Murphy's Market even when it wasn't the most convenient option, because they understood they were supporting something important. Mrs. Murphy had blossomed in her role as general manager, freed from the daily worry about survival to focus on growth and innovation. She had become something of a celebrity in small business circles, invited to speak at conferences about successful community retail strategies, though she always kept Chuck's involvement confidential. On this particular Saturday morning, Sarah noticed a familiar figure browsing in the produce section. Chuck was selecting tomatoes with the same careful attention he'd shown 6 months earlier, but now he moved through a store that reflected his investment in people and community values. As he approached her register with his modest selection of groceries, Sarah's smile was especially bright. Over the months, they had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared values, though she still sometimes marveled at the surreal nature of having casual conversations with someone she'd grown up watching in movies. "The usual excellent service, I see," Chuck said quietly as Sarah began scanning his items, keeping his voice low to maintain the discretion that had become their routine. "Just following the example I learned from a very wise customer," Sarah replied, her eyes twinkling with the shared secret of their first meeting. "Someone once told me not to give up hope because help could come from unexpected places." Chuck chuckled, remembering his own words from that difficult night 6 months ago. Smart customer. Did his advice work out? "Better than I ever could have imagined," Sarah said, glancing around the thriving store. "It turns out that sometimes the most unexpected help comes from the most unexpected heroes." As Chuck prepared to leave, Sarah handed him his receipt along with a small card. It was an invitation to the store's 6-month celebration event the following weekend, which would feature local musicians, food from their catering department, and a silent auction to benefit the community scholarship fund that Chuck had quietly established. "I hope you can make it," Sarah said. "It's going to be a celebration of everything this community can accomplish when people work together." Chuck pocketed the invitation, knowing he would definitely attend, probably in his usual casual disguise but with immense pride in what had been accomplished. As he walked toward the exit, he could hear Sarah greeting the next customer with the same warmth and professionalism that had first caught his attention. The automatic doors slid open, and Chuck stepped out into the bright afternoon sunshine. Behind him, Murphy's Market hummed with the energy of a successful business and the warmth of a community gathering place. The store had not just survived, it had become a model for what was possible when someone was willing to invest in people and principles rather than just profit margins. As Chuck drove home to Gina, he reflected on how a simple trip for groceries had turned into one of the most rewarding investments of his life. He had set out to buy vegetables and ended up helping to preserve something much more valuable. The idea that small businesses built on integrity and community service could not only survive, but thrive in a world dominated by corporate giants. Most importantly, he had kept a promise to a young woman whose dignity and determination had reminded him why success was meaningless unless it was used to help others achieve their own dreams. Sarah Henderson was now well on her way to finishing her social work degree. Her grandmother was receiving excellent care, and she had a career with real growth potential. Sometimes, Chuck thought as he pulled into his driveway, the greatest victories weren't won in martial arts competitions or on movie sets, but in quiet moments when someone chose to use their resources and influence to lift others up. The real magic happened when that help allowed good people to help themselves and then pay it forward to others. Murphy's Market would continue to thrive, its employees would build successful careers, and the community would have a gathering place that honored both tradition and innovation. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Chuck was already wondering where his next anonymous grocery shopping trip might lead him.